world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back here on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Wednesday, November 5th, as you are listening to this. Now, when I talked about in the previous podcasts, it was election day yesterday. And I thought by the time I recorded this, I would have some results, and I do. Now, there are a lot of local races all over the country, and I'm not going to get into every state and every race. I'd be doing this for hours upon hours if I did. However, there were some notable things coming out of election night last night, and this should put establishment Democrats on notice, but should also put Republicans on notice. Now, what happened? Well, in New York City, Mamdani won the mayoral race. He should become the new mayor of New York City. He won with like 65% of the vote. Now, it's no surprise that he won. I think he won by a higher margin than expected. But look at the two candidates that he ran against. The Republican was Sliwa or something like that, Siwa, something like that. And he was not a great candidate for the Republicans. In fact, he was so bad that the Republicans were trying to get him to drop out and to endorse Cuomo. Cuomo was the independent who had been a Democrat, could not beat Mamdani in a primary, and then decided to run as an independent, as a spoiler candidate maybe. He represented, in a way, establishment Democrats, but he had also had a checkered past, resigning in disgrace, I believe, as governor of New York. If I remember right, he had I think it was a sexual harassment scandal, something like that. And they said, no, we don't want you. We want to go with the Democratic Socialist, who is talking about doing things to make sure people can afford to live, make sure people can afford to eat, etc. And they said, we don't care if he is talking about potentially raising city taxes by a little bit in order to make those things happen. That's where establishment Democrats need to be paying attention. People, or at least voters in certain areas, are now saying they would be willing to pay a little more in taxes if it means getting the things they want, and that they would be able to live a better life. Now we move over to the governor race in New Jersey. Now, they were hoping for a close race. And one of the numbers I saw said something like it was projected with the Democrat, whose name I can't think of right now, won by 65% of the vote. And they were expecting it to be close. It was close enough that Donald Trump tried to intimidate the vote and send in poll watchers to see if they could, get people to vote a certain way, because all the federal watchers were there and they're going to report on all the problems. Of course, there were no problems. The election went off like you would expect. And then you go to Virginia. Now, in Virginia, again, the Democrat won with like 65% of the vote. Another race that nobody expected to be that far off. But that wasn't the only story in Virginia. Now, what I am hearing is that in Virginia, they also had races for their House of Delegates, which is, I'm assuming, because I'm not in Virginia, I am not entirely familiar with Virginia politics, but I'm assuming that is supposed to be something similar to the House of Representatives. And if I'm wrong, hopefully somebody will correct me in the comments. But not only did the Democrats regain control, but they had a narrow margin going in. They were up by like 1-2 seats, something like that. They are projected to not only retain control, but retain control by 10 to 13 seats. That is a massive pickup for the Democrats. So it's looking like, as you start looking at those races, that there's momentum in the Democratic Party's favor that they are doing something correct here, that they're pushing the right buttons, and that people are pissed off at Republicans. And then you go over to the other statewide race, another one that Republicans were desperate to kill. They didn't want it to happen. They tried to sue to keep it off the ballot and everything like that. And I am talking about Prop 50 in California. Prop 50 was the voter measure that was brought forward by the governor, Gavin Newsom, to redistrict California to carve out 5 more seats for Democrats. This was a response to Texas doing the same thing, except the difference between California and Texas is the state of Texas did not take it to the voters. The state of Texas, their Republican-led legislature just did it. Gavin Newsom in California said, okay, we got to take it to the voters first. And this is only going to be a temporary redistricting because in 2030, there will be another census and they will have to redraw the maps again. This is just a response to what Texas did, trying to keep the balance in the House of Representatives on the national level about where it was before. Now, I don't think it's going to matter with what Texas did or California, really, because I'm thinking that the House of Representatives in the midterms, if this is any indication, they could end up picking up 40, 50 seats. If this is a view of how things are going nationwide for Republicans. Now, we'll have to see how things go between here and there. Obviously, we have a long way to go between the midterms. We have a year. Now we need to see what candidates get put up, who's running for re-election, who's getting primaried. Are the Democrats running candidates in every House district? They should. Some of those, they don't really run a Democrat. Maybe they back an independent or something like that because they don't think they can win. Well, I'm hoping this gives them some momentum. Now, of course, Republicans already have their first talking point. One of their reasons why they want to explain away how bad they did in these elections. It's Donald Trump was not on the ballot. Wait a minute. They're already saying Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot. So they're saying they can't win without Donald Trump, huh? That's interesting. Why? Because Donald Trump will never be on a ballot again. He won't. Now, they may try to gaslight you, and whenever things go south for Donald Trump, they try to bring this narrative back up about Donald Trump running for a third term. There are multiple reasons why Donald Trump will never run for a third term. First of all, his health. Donald Trump's health is not good. He slurs his speech in public. His face droops after a while. We've seen multiple images of him with a drooping face. He forgets who he's talking to when he's talked to people. Several months ago, when he was meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, he said he was going to Russia to meet with Putin. He comes up, he just makes things up as he goes along, talks about deals that haven't actually been agreed to, which that's more of a typical trademark narcissist where he just lies about things because, he has to have the win. But then you have this Asia trip that he just got back from last week. And at several points during this Asia trip, he highlighted things about his health that come to light. He talks about taking, he called it an aptitude or an IQ test. But when you start listening to what he is describing the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. He talks about how, they ask you to remember several words. They come back and ask you later. You had to name 3 animals. You had to draw a clock. That is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Now, that is not something you give to a routine physical, for your yearly physical. I've had yearly physicals. I know a lot of you have had yearly physicals, and you have never taken a Montreal Cognitive Assessment. The only time you are given a Montreal Cognitive Assessment is if you are suspected of suffering some kind of serious brain injury, a stroke, maybe some massive head trauma from a fall, something like that, where they're trying to gauge just where your cognitive abilities are, or if they think you are a risk for dementia. And once they start giving you those, the way I understand it is that they give them periodically to benchmark where you're at. Are you getting better? Are you not getting better? Are you getting worse? Are you staying the same? Are you improving in some areas and not in others, etc.? And they use it as benchmarks. But the fact that he's talking about it and he calls it a difficult test, anybody of a reasonable mind would not call it difficult. Now, that could be one of two things with Donald Trump. We know how Donald Trump operates. Everything with him has got to be overdone and grandiose, etc. He's got to be the best at everything because he's a narcissist. And that he, by definition of being a narcissist, he's got to be the smartest in the room. Listen to him, he'll tell you he's the smartest in the room in any room he goes into. And by doing that, when he says things like, oh, it was really difficult, he's trying to make it sound like it was some difficult test, like he was taking the SATs or something like that. He's not. He's taking the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And if he actually believes it was difficult, that means he's impaired. Now, Republicans need to address the fact that he's impaired and figure out a way to move past Donald Trump. And I think you may start seeing more and more of that now. Why? Because this was their first test, their first answer by voters to everything they're doing and everything related to Donald Trump. And they got their butts kicked. Now, if they're saying, well, we didn't win because Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot, newsflash, Donald Trump will never be on a ballot again. And if they mean they can't win without Donald Trump on the ballot, that means they're admitting they will never win an election again, or at least not in the short term, which is good news for Democrats, good news for reasonable-minded people, and maybe we can actually have some progress in this country. But now, why wouldn't Donald Trump be on the ballot? One, I was just talking about him taking this cognitive assessment. Okay, beyond the cognitive assessment, he has issues with dragging his foot and balance issues, and multiple times where he was supposed to be doing something and he looked like he was just completely lost, like he was just wandering around. The same things they were accusing Joe Biden of doing, which the only way they could make that happen was with edited clips to make it seem like he didn't know what he was doing. So I don't think he's going to be around come 2028 for him to even have the chance to be on a ballot. It's just not going to happen. There is a greater than zero chance that between now and 2028, we will have President J.D. Vance, period. Just because of Donald Trump's health. He doesn't eat well. He doesn't exercise. We haven't seen him go golfing in forever. The only pictures I've seen of him golfing recently was from a couple of weeks, maybe a month ago or so, where he was out golfing with his granddaughter. But she was the one golfing. He was just driving the golf cart from the pictures I've seen. And he did something you're not supposed to do in golf, and that was drive over the green with the golf cart. But Donald Trump couldn't even be bothered to get out of the cart and walk over and watch her putt it in. So Donald Trump is not in good health. He may be gone. J.D. Vance may have to step in. But what else might happen? Well, Republicans may end up turning on Donald Trump. And that could happen in one of several ways. First of all, if his health continues to go downhill, J.D. Vance could invoke the 25th Amendment. Except there's a problem with that. Multiple problems, really. J.D. Vance can only invoke the 25th Amendment with the consent of the cabinet, basically. They have to agree that Donald Trump is impaired and unable to be president. And this cabinet, I don't think they would do that until Donald Trump gets to the point where he can't function, which would actually be a benefit for JD Vance because of the other problem with using the 25th Amendment. If Donald Trump still has access to where he can communicate with anybody, if he is uh, able to post on Truth Social or whatever, despite his condition, and JD Vance tries to use the 25th Amendment, JD Vance will burn the Republican Party down around him. Donald Trump will burn the Republican Party down around him if they try to kick him out with the 25th Amendment. And he is able to communicate. Now, if he has more, we think he may have been having strokes. If he does have one or has another one that leaves him in some kind of a vegetative state or something, not that I'm necessarily wishing that on him. I'm talking about what could happen. If that does, then they could use the 25th Amendment without worry that Donald Trump would try to burn the party down around them. But if he can communicate, he would. Now, there's the other option, and that is impeachment. And you may think I'm crazy for saying that Republicans would impeach Donald Trump. Here's the thing. Donald Trump cannot run another election. 25th Amendment or 22nd Amendment says he cannot run for more than 2 terms. And for anybody who says, well, he'll run as JD's vice president and JD Vance would just abdicate, that can't happen either because the 12th Amendment specifically says if you are ineligible to run for president, you are ineligible to run for vice president. And there is no way they are going to try to name him Speaker of the House in 28 and have both the newly elected president and vice president resign to make Donald Trump president. That's just not going to happen. It is not within the realm of possibility. And there's even a good chance that the House of Representatives is held by Democrats in 28 after the midterms. So that wouldn't happen either. Okay. So if they impeach Donald Trump, which they could because he's not going to run for re-election, what could they do? They could impeach him for a lot of things. He's giving them plenty of fuel for impeachment. Okay, you have the strikes to boats in Venezuela. You have everything with the economy. You have holding up SNAP money. You have all of these things. There is plenty they could use. Now the question becomes, will they? Will they use it? Well, maybe. If things get bad enough and they fear that they're going to be that he's going to cost them the midterms, they haven't realized it. They may start to realize it now after these elections where they were expecting them to be close and they're getting beat with, Democrats getting 65% of the vote and picking up 10 seats in the House of Delegates in Virginia. They may be reevaluating. This is the first real answer to Donald Trump that voters have had since he got back in office. And Republicans may be looking at it going, oh God, he's going to cost us in the midterms. We may lose the House. We may lose the Senate. We have to do something. And if they think by removing him, it is going to make things better, they will. Because one thing that politicians, and this goes to both sides of the aisle, one thing that almost all politicians crave is keeping their own power. Now, if they impeach and remove him, that would make JD Vance president. And for those of you that think JD Vance would be a worse president than Donald Trump, remember this. JD Vance doesn't have the pull over the Republican Party like Donald Trump does. He just doesn't. So JD Vance would not get his way with the Republican Party in Congress at all. Wouldn't happen. He'd say, do this for me. They wouldn't do it. In fact, Donald Trump is not having his way nearly as well as he used to. Donald Trump has been trying to tell the Senate Republicans to kill the filibuster. Why? Because they want to pass this continuing resolution and reopen the government. Problem with that is Democrats are blocking it with the filibuster. Now, Republicans love the filibuster when they're in the minority party. Democrats love the filibuster when they're in the minority party. Why? Because the filibuster is that rule that requires 60 votes to end debate. And if you don't have it, you can't end debate and move on. So the bill stays open. Well, Republicans like to use it to block things Democrats do. When Republicans are in the minority, Democrats love to block the stuff that Republicans want to do when they're in the minority. So nothing gets done without bipartisan support. And this bill does not have bipartisan support. Now, why does the CR not have bipartisan support? Well, because Republicans promised back in March to extend the Affordable Care Act subsidies, or at least have discussions about it or do something about it. Well, they said, we'll talk about it later. We've got until the end of the calendar year. Later's here. The end of the calendar year is less than 2 months away. Democrats are saying, hey, you promised we would talk about it. Let's talk about it. And what are they saying? Yeah, we'll talk about it later. We'll talk about it later. Then you have the Medicaid cuts. After they passed their clean CR back in March, Republicans came through with the one big beautiful bill and cut a bunch of funding to a bunch of programs. A bunch of programs, including Medicaid, food stamps, put in bullshit work requirements, all these kind of things. Okay. And then they come back with, well, this is a clean CR. No, it's not. It's not anywhere close to a clean CR. If it was, it would be funding things at March levels. But we're not there. We're not funding things at March levels. We are funding them at the new levels after the one big beautiful bill, which means the Democrats are saying, hey, we negotiated in good faith with you in March. You stabbed us in the back. Why would we believe you? Now, after these election results, I've been saying I think this may be what gets Republicans to the table. And we'd already been hearing that there may be some movement. But Donald Trump wants to get rid of the filibuster. And Senate Republicans are not doing that. And it sounds like he is getting more and more pissed that he may start going after and starting to put pressure on these Senate Republicans. And from the story I read, the article I read, they were talking about publicly going after him, the name calling, maybe primary challenging him if they can. Here's the problem. You have a harder time primarying senators because every 6 years, every 2 years, only a third of the Senate is up for re-election because they serve 6-year terms. So for somebody that just got elected last year, they are not up for re-election until 2030. By the time 2030 comes around, trying to primary them for something they did now may not work. And Donald Trump may not be around for them to challenge. He may not be around to put that primary challenger out there. But he's going to try to bully and pressure and force the Senate Republicans to do the nuclear option and to get rid of the filibuster so he gets his way. And it sounds like there's no appetite in the Senate to do that. They want to protect it because they know at some point, possibly as early as 26, but probably in 2028, they will be back in the minority party. And after 28, there's a good chance that there will be a Democrat in the presidency. So if the House isn't in the hands of Democrats, they have the Senate and they have the presidency, they could push through whatever they wanted unless there's the filibuster there to stop them. And that's how Republicans are looking at it, going, well, if we want to stop Democrats in 28 after, the next Democrat wins, whoever that front runner might be, whoever ends up winning the Democratic nomination, we're going to want to prevent them doing a lot of what they want to do. So we need the filibuster. But Donald Trump doesn't care about what happens in 2028 after or 2029 rather, when the next term starts. He doesn't care because he won't be here. He won't be in power. He won't have access to the powers of the presidency. It'll be somebody else's problem. He only cares about getting that win right now. Okay, So filibuster probably not going away. Donald Trump going to start putting pressure on Senate Republicans. All that's going to do is start causing Senate Republicans to fracture even more. Now that may lead them to negotiating in good faith with Democrats to come up with a bill to actually fund and open the government for an extended period of time. Now we had been hearing on Monday that there was some movement, even though the House is not in session, that House Republicans were meeting with Democrats, and they had a kind of a bipartisan framework of a potential deal that would extend the Affordable Care Act subsidies for 2 or 3 years. I think it was 2. I didn't hear anything about the Medicaid cuts, but apparently it was a start. That if they can at least do that much, it would be a starting point, because that is the most pressing need. Well, if Donald Trump puts too much pressure on Senate Republicans, they may fracture enough that they start negotiating with Democrats and coming out with any sort of a deal. And maybe we do get to something that opens the government back up. Now, today is the 36th day of the government shutdown. This is now the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. And Donald Trump will continue to hold the record for longest government shutdown, and it's going to keep growing every single day until they come up with something. But Donald Trump doesn't want to negotiate with Democrats because he thinks that makes him look weak. For somebody who has claimed to be this master negotiator, this brilliant businessman who knows how to do it all, he thinks negotiating makes him look weak. Now, they negotiated during his first term. And multiple times they were able to come up with continuing resolutions to fund the government. And in fact, they were able to negotiate with Democrats to end the government shutdown the last time because it stretched into a new Congress. It went so far, it was after the 2018 midterm elections. It was in December of that year, stretched into January. And it went so long that they swore in a new Congress. So, and that was when Democrats, led by Nancy Pelosi, had control of the House of Representatives. They had to negotiate with Democrats. Donald Trump did, and they were able to open the government. But this time he doesn't want to negotiate. He thinks he should just get his way. And that's not happening, and he is so confused. He doesn't know how this is happening. Now, I'm fully expecting there'd be more of a meltdown, a bigger late night rant about losing the midterms, or not the midterms, these elections in New Jersey, Virginia, etc., about how Democrats cheated. And, well, if I would have been on the ballot, I would have won. Donald Trump is going to try to do all of that. So, with that being said, we'll have to see what kind of a response we get here. Now, Donald Trump was supposed to, I believe, as of today, at least partially fund the SNAP program. Now, they are saying that there is going to be, that they only have the funds to fund about half a month of benefits, which would, if they get the money released and states actually kick it out, that would mean you would have about 2 weeks from today, maybe let's be generous, 2 weeks from Friday, to actually come up with the rest of the funding for the month. And hopefully by then, Republicans and Democrats have come to some kind of a deal to fund SNAP benefits. But Republicans will tell you, oh, it's the Democrats, they don't want to fund food programs. Except that doesn't make any sense. Why? Well, there was a bunch of money cut from SNAP programs in the One Big Beautiful Bill. How about we start there? Okay, beyond the money that was cut in the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was passed with no Democratic support, then you have the fact that Democrats tried to pass with unanimous consent a resolution to fund the SNAP program through the government shutdown. It got shot down by Republicans. And then you have the fact that Mike Johnson is keeping the House of Representatives out. Now, we will see what excuse he comes up with. Now, it sounds like they're not coming back till Monday or Tuesday of next week at this point. They're on week 6, maybe 7 something like that, of being gone, with weekly having their scheduled votes canceled. Why? Because Mike Johnson doesn't want to bring the House back into session, because he thinks he's succeeding at putting pressure on the Democrats. Now, these election results may change his tune and force him to come back to and bring the House back into session to negotiate, because they're not playing from the upper hand that they thought they were anymore. Now the voters have spoken, and the voters have said, yeah, we don't like the bullshit you're doing. We want you to stop. We want to vote for the other party. And they turned out and they voted in big numbers. So Mike Johnson may have to bring the House of Representatives back into session, but when they do, he's got multiple problems he has to face. Now, the first of those, speaking of elections, is Representative Grijalva, who won her election back in September. Mike Johnson has yet to swear her in. He has given all kinds of excuses as to why he won't swear her in. His biggest one has always been, well, we need to wait for the House to be back in full session to swear her in, which is a lie. Why? Because earlier this year, there were 2 vacancies for the House in Florida because of positions that had taken positions in the Trump administration. One who actually took their position, the other one belonging to Matt Gaetz, who ended up having already resigned from the House, but then not taking the position because he couldn't get confirmed. Well, when those 2 special elections happened, the House was out on one of their breaks, and Mike Johnson swore in those 2 members of Congress without the House being in full session. So that's out. I think he's tried to say, well, we have to have the government open to swear in the House of Representatives, to swear members in. Doesn't matter there either. Why? As I was talking about a little bit ago, during the last government shutdown under a Trump administration, it lasted into a new Congress. So they had to swear in an entire new House of Representatives. You can do that during a government shutdown. That don't affect anything. And he's just got excuse after excuse after excuse for not seating her and having her take her place as a member of the House. And as far as I know, she is not actually receiving any pay right now for doing this. Now, if you ask me, she should get her pay from the time she won her election, because it is not her fault that he is not swearing her in. I don't know exactly how congressional pay works when it comes to a situation like this, because we typically don't have these kind of situations. Now, why is he keeping her out of the House of Representatives? Well, he's keeping the House out because he doesn't want to swear her in. Because if he swears her in, they are going to have to answer for the Epstein files. Because she would be the 218th signature on the discharge petition to release the Epstein files. Now, this petition is to call for a vote that is on a resolution that would force the DOJ to release the files. But even if it passes the House, it is not enough on its own. It would still have to pass the Senate, which I don't know what its fate in the Senate would be. It may die in committee. It may never get a vote, because John Thune doesn't have to bring anything that comes over from the House up for a vote. So it could die and nothing happens. But see, Mike Johnson doesn't want to have the members of the House of Representatives on record voting one way or the other when it comes to the Epstein files. Why? Well, because if they vote in favor of releasing the Epstein files, then they got to answer to Donald Trump, who does not want the Epstein files released. In fact, he has said before that if you vote in favor of releasing them or in favor of the discharge petition, you are hostile to Donald Trump and you are hostile to this administration. And he was going to, primary you and all of these things. Now, again, as I was talking about earlier, how much weight does that threat actually hold? Well, for the House of Representatives, it holds a little more weight, because the entirety of the House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years. That means in November of next year, right about a year away now, that those seats, all of them are going to be up for grabs. And if Donald Trump tries to primary out some of these people that he views as disloyal, well, it is entirely possible that they end up losing their seat because they got primaried out. Now, that may not be a pickup for the Democrats, depending on who the Republicans pick as a replacement, because some of these districts are so heavily gerrymandered, it's a guarantee that the Republican candidate wins no matter who it is, as long as they have an R next to their name. But as I was talking about earlier, Republicans, well, politicians in general, but specifically Republicans, they like to hold on to their own power. So they're worried about getting primaried and facing the wrath of Donald Trump. But then you have to deal with the voters. The voters want the Epstein files released. Why? Because they have been told for years that there are nothing but Democrats in the Epstein files, that Democrats are the ones that do all of these horrible things to children, and that they need to be held accountable for their crimes, for their sins. And they want the evidence that proves their case, because we say things like, it's not just Democrats. It's not trans people. It's not drag queens. It is Republicans. It is ministers. It is billionaires. We've talked about it. And because we make them look stupid, which isn't very hard, I know, but because they're mad at us for making them look dumb, they want the files released so they can finally have their justification and prove us libtards wrong, that it's nothing but Democrats that do these horrible things, and then they think they'll shut us up and they'll finally have owned the libs. And this wouldn't have even been an issue if Donald Trump didn't do what he always does, which is fuck up. He ran on a campaign promise of releasing the Epstein files. So his voters and the MAGA base itself wants the files released. So if Mike Johnson holds this vote in the House of Representatives and says, okay, are we going to release it or not? And a bunch of them say, yeah, no, we're not going to release the files. The voters are going to be pissed and they may get voted out. So if they vote yes, they would stand with the voters and what they want, but then piss off Donald Trump and still might get primaried and voted out. Mike Johnson doesn't want to deal with it. So he doesn't want to bring them back at all for that. His answer is just to keep the House out as long as possible. Now, one of the ways this Epstein file situation could end is with a vote to vacate the chair, which would be to remove Speaker Johnson as Speaker of the House. And there's a lot of grumbling from what I am reading in the House of Representatives that they're pissed that they're not able to be in the House getting to work and doing things. It would not take very many Republicans to side with all Democrats to vote out Mike Johnson. So they bring the House back into session. He could end up facing a vote to remove him as Speaker just because he's kept them out for this long. He could also face a vote to remove if they bring the Epstein files up for a vote and it passes, because Donald Trump would call one of his MAGA buddies in Congress and say, hey, he was supposed to kill that. He didn't kill that for me. I want him out as Speaker. Either one of those two ways could end up costing him the speakership. And then there's the third way. If what we're hearing about there potentially being some bipartisan negotiations starting, and if after these elections, Republicans decide to actually negotiate with Democrats to open the government and fund the government, then Donald Trump may get pissed off because, oh, well, you're negotiating. I said don't negotiate. Get him out of there. We need somebody else as Speaker. And the same problem arises. And it wouldn't take very many Republicans to side with all Democrats to vote out Mike Johnson. Now, why would the Democrats vote to get rid of Mike Johnson? Because why would they vote to keep him? They have no reason to vote to keep Mike Johnson in his position. None. Why? Because he hasn't done anything worthwhile to keep him in there. He has lied to the Democrats repeatedly. They negotiated in good faith back in March on that clean CR, and then they passed the one big beautiful bill and did all the cuts. Well, that's not negotiating in good faith. That's pulling the rug out from under the Democrats. And now you have the bullshit with Representative Grijalva and just everything like that. Democrats have no reason to save Mike Johnson. Now, there is one way in which they would save Mike Johnson, and that is if the government is not open yet when they try to oust him as Speaker. They may say, hey, Mike Johnson, look, we know they're going to try to oust you, but they need our support because not all of your caucus is going to vote to oust you. You've got enough votes to save you if we get behind you. But here's what we want. And they may use it as leverage once the negotiations start in earnest, if those things come to pass. Maybe that's where they start getting, instead of 2 years, maybe they get 3 on the Affordable Care Act subsidies. And maybe they can actually get some negotiations done on the Medicaid cuts and some other things that they want done. This is going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Now, things are going to change after today because of those elections last night. We've been talking about it. We'll have to see how the Republicans react in Congress to the environmental change, because things aren't as easy, cut and dry as it was just one day ago. They were still running on their attitude coming out of the 2024 election was that, they won in a landslide. They had a mandate and all of this. Well, Democrats are proving, at least in the big races this year, that turned voters out and that they were winning by 65% with 65% of the vote and outperforming Kamala Harris in a lot of those states. That it is saying, hey, the tide is turning. Now let's see if Republicans are paying attention. Now, I was talking about funding SNAP benefits for a couple of weeks. And one of the questions that has been coming up is the money actually there? I don't know. There is supposed to be an emergency fund within the USDA that oversees food stamp programs, and that money is supposed to be there for times like this when the government is shut down or there's a natural disaster or something, and they need to fund the food stamp program. But Donald Trump is coming up with excuses as to why they can't fund it. Says, well, I don't have the legal authority. Yet he does, because they did it during his first term. And now they're saying, well, they only have the money to release about 2 weeks worth of funds per person. It's not a lot, but it'll be something, and it will at least help. Like I was talking about earlier, this may lead to the Republicans and Democrats being able to negotiate or give them at least a deadline to negotiate, etc. But the question becomes, is the money there? And it makes you wonder, because they act like the money's not there. And Donald Trump and this administration has seemingly been able to find money for all kinds of things with questionable appropriations coming from Congress. Now, Donald Trump has proven he doesn't care about what Congress actually says, like when he told Pete Hegseth to find money to pay the military to make sure they got paid for their first check last month. Well, we'd heard they did it. I don't know for a fact that they got paid, but supposedly they had found some research and development grant that hadn't been paid out. So there was money in an account somewhere and they were able to move it around. But see, this is what happens with narcissists and people like Donald Trump. He's taking from one account to pay another bill, and then he'll take the money that he would have paid that other bill and pay a third bill. And before you know it, there's no money anywhere. And the whole thing falls apart. But see, this is how Donald Trump has always done his business. That is part of what he was found financially liable for in New York City. When they looked at his business records for his mortgages and his loans and things like that, he would go get a big loan on one of his properties. And when that started coming due and he couldn't afford to necessarily pay it off or wanted to, to refinance or whatever, and had to figure it out, he would then go get a different loan on a different property for even more money, pay off the first loan, come up with a little bit more of, running capital that he can live off of for a while. And then he'd have to start paying off that loan. And when he needed money to pay that loan off again, he'd go get a third loan. And he was just constantly cycling loans, borrowing on one property to pay on another, etc. Ultimately, that doesn't work. If you're constantly moving your debt around, you're not getting anywhere. But in this case, it's not debt that Donald Trump is moving around. It's actually budget. And he is taking things that were, or at least we are assuming that he is maybe taking money that was appropriated for one thing and saying, well, they won't miss it if we take it right now and we'll use it for this over here. Assuming that they have an infinite amount of time to either replace it or that he will just get Congress or in his Republican buddies in Congress specifically to tack some extra funding into one of the bills, because these bills potentially run thousands of pages, that they tack in, a subline somewhere where nobody has a chance to actually read it to, reauthorize money back into the account they pilfered from. So if the money's gone from food stamp program and that emergency fund really doesn't have anything in it, the question is who's responsible? Well, ultimately it should be Donald Trump, but that's not how that would go. He would turn around and he would throw somebody under the bus, whether that's his agricultural secretary, whether that's his head of the USDA, something like that. Maybe he leaves Marco Rubio holding the bag. Maybe it wouldn't really be JD Vance because he's the vice president. It would take Congress to get rid of him. But he comes up with a scapegoat saying, well, I ran it through them. They said we could do this. It's their fault because Donald Trump takes no responsibility for anything. And then we would have to just move back on. Okay. But ultimately, when Donald Trump is gone, here's what I think is going to happen. If this gets found out during his term, there's going to be somebody scapegoated, like I was just talking about. If it's not till after Donald Trump is gone, what I think the next president should do is they should do something like what Doge should have been. And I did not agree with Doge. You can go back and look at any of my videos talking about it. I thought it was a waste of time and money and effort. But if they were really looking for waste, fraud, and abuse, this would have been a months-long or years-long investigation with forensic accountants. And I think the next Democratic president should probably have a forensic accountant go through the books of the federal government and try to figure out where all the money is and account for it all. And maybe all is not, an exact figure there or an exact idea, but try to figure out, at least in rough terms, where this money went and how much of it was manipulated by somebody like Donald Trump, who has shown a willingness to move funds around without Congress's approval and just making it work when it fits his narrative. I think they should actually look into that and try to figure out how much is there, how much was stolen, how much was spent inappropriately. And then Congress, as part of this process, should figure out a way to put extra safeguards in place to prevent the next president, whether it be Republican or Democrat, I don't care, from doing something similar. Now, I think there may be some amendments passed and some other safeguards passed after Donald Trump is out of office and Republicans are not in power, to prevent something like Donald Trump administration happening ever again. Now, I do want to correct something I talked about in yesterday's podcast. Yesterday, I had said that there was going to be oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court on Donald Trump's tariff case yesterday. I was wrong. Those oral arguments are actually happening today. Now, Donald Trump is talking all sorts of doom and gloom over on his Truth Social page about what could happen if the Supreme Court takes away his tariff power, talking about how it would affect national security and financial independence and all these things. What would happen if they take away his tariff ability would actually be market stability, because we need to figure out, we need to know, and our trading partners need to know what the tariffs are going to be, how it works, et cetera, and they don't need to be handled on a whim like Donald Trump does. He sees an ad about himself that he doesn't like coming from a foreign country, and he stops trade negotiations and puts a 50% tariff on them. That's not answering to national security. That's being petty and trying to hurt them. It's trying to hit them back, but it's also kind of weak. But Donald Trump is a weak man. So these oral arguments are going to be before the Supreme Court today. Now, how does that work? Well, they're going to go, and normally there would only be a limited amount of time for both sides to air their case. But it's not like a normal trial. How oral arguments typically work, from what I understand, is they're given an attempt to state their case, and then the justices ask questions of both sides. Like the plaintiff in this case, which would be the state saying, "Hey, you don't have tariff authority," um, would have so long to state their case. The justices would ask questions, figuring out where they get the basis for their interpretation, etc. And then they would turn around and ask the same of the defense, in this case, the DOJ and the Trump administration. Now, Donald Trump had talked about going to these oral arguments. Why would he go? Well, one, no president has ever gone to oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court, mostly because they are viewed as a separate but equal branch of government. So no president has ever infringed on that separate but equal status. However, Donald Trump had talked about it. Why? Because he thinks he can go in and he can mean mug them, and his presence there would intimidate the justices that he put on the court, because he put them there. They owe him, and they should be loyal to him. Well, I don't think that would actually work, because Donald Trump can't remove a Supreme Court justice, not by himself. So, with that being said, he thought maybe he could intimidate. At least that's what my feeling was from the way he was talking about it. And then we know how Donald Trump thinks. He thinks he's this great orator, that he has the best words, and he can say things and he can convince anybody of anything. So part of me thinks he wanted to go because he was going to try to, even though it is not how the procedure would normally go, normally only attorneys are allowed to speak before the Supreme Court. But he thinks he would get a chance to get up there and speak and talk, and maybe he could convince the Supreme Court to see things his way. Well, I think when he found out he wasn't going to get a chance to talk, because that's not how it works, I think he kind of lost interest. And because it was going to be talking about things not entirely directly related to Donald Trump, and he wasn't going to be the center of attention, you'd have to deal with him potentially dozing off. I mean, we've seen him fall asleep in public, seem to startle himself awake at numerous points, leading back to my comments about him not being in good health. So he's not going. Now, I think his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is going. And I don't know if he's going to just be in the gallery potentially, because, again, I don't think he can be up there actually arguing before the Supreme Court. I believe it has to be a actual attorney. And I'm not sure if Scott Bessent is, but I know there are requirements as far as who can argue before the Supreme Court. Now, how is the court going to rule on this tariff case? Who knows? Realistically, who knows? But I think the Supreme Court is actually going to side against Donald Trump. And I'm sure some of you are thinking I'm crazy for thinking like that. But here's why I think that way. This Supreme Court, if you look at a lot of their rulings and how they decide things, they have said that they are looking at the letter of the law and what's in the laws they're ruling on. Well, in the law they're ruling on, the word tariff does not apply. Something that the lower court and the appellate court both pointed out in their rulings, that the word tariff doesn't show up anywhere in that law. So, and it doesn't look like Donald Trump has legal authority under the law he is citing to give himself tariff authority. And then when you go to the Constitution itself clearly says that the power to impose tariffs and duties and things like that rests with Congress. Okay. So between those two things, it seems pretty clear. But then usually the Supreme Court, and this changes from court to court, but you have to look at how they have handled over the course of their entire history. They look to see, how does Congress react? Well, last week, in 3 separate votes, there were bipartisan support to pass 3 resolutions that are going to die in the House of Representatives because they will not get a vote or they may not pass. And even if they do pass, Donald Trump would never sign them. But trying to end Donald Trump's emergency declarations for these tariffs in some cases and to reverse all of Donald Trump's tariffs. Well, with them doing that, what are they doing? Well, that means at least one of the 2 chambers of Congress is sending a signal that they disagree with Donald Trump and his tariff policies, etc. So the Supreme Court is going to weigh on that about how that, when they make their decision. It is, they're not going to say, well, Congress specifically said we don't like it, but they're going to look at it as a whole and say, okay, you add the fact that the law says nothing about tariffs. The Constitution says the power of tariffs reside with Congress because they fall under duties and stuff, and that is one of the powers of Congress. And you have Congress passing, or at least half of Congress passing a resolution that says we don't agree with Donald Trump's tariffs and we want to reverse them. You add those things together and it gives a roadmap to the Supreme Court for how to rule, saying, okay, well, maybe they go that route. Now, are we going to get a ruling today? No. We may get an idea based on how the oral arguments go as to which way the Supreme Court is leaning, but we're not going to get a ruling. We probably won't see that until sometime between May and July of next year. Next year. That is usually when the end of the session comes up for the Supreme Court. And that's when we get, those kind of answers. And they are long, deliberative answers, and they are full of legalese. But the whole point of them is to give courts roadmaps for how things go. Now, what could happen if they rule against Donald Trump? To hear Donald Trump tell it, it's going to be all doom and gloom. But I don't think so. This is going to actually help the economy because you can't have tariffs being decided on a whim. But beyond that, could Donald Trump still get his way with tariffs? Maybe, but it'd be harder because he'd have to go through Congress. And because he's not a king, despite him wanting to act for like he is, he wants to be able to use a power that is not inherent to the presidency with these tariffs. He would have to go to Congress and get them to pass something. And right now they can't even agree to fund the government and reopen everything. Do you think they're going to agree on how to put these tariffs on foreign countries? I don't think so. So that's kind of where things are at with that. We will have to see how those oral arguments play out today. And, we'll have to see what kind of shakeup there is within the Republican Party after today because of the elections last night, where it was looking like, at least according to the results I saw, Democrats were winning the major races that we were following, I think in almost every case with 65% of the vote or better, and outperforming Kamala Harris in those areas. Now, we compare to Kamala Harris because that was the presidential race, top of the ticket. That is just a benchmark they use. But anyway, that is where that stands. We'll have to see what today brings, and if today brings any fresh negotiations about this government shutdown. So that's it for the Analytical Iowan podcast for today. I will be back tomorrow with more to talk about because there's always something to talk about with this administration and how bad things are right now. Hopefully things will get better. It's just going to take time. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you tomorrow.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.